Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It is First Amendment Friday, and I want you to consider this. Should states in America who already have states' rights, and they certainly are in charge of everything in theory except the enumerated powers of the federal government, should they be able to say, well, we don't like these federal laws, we think they're unconstitutional, so we're just not going to follow them? To talk about this, Byron Henry joins me now, an attorney from Dallas and Fort Worth and a constitutional scholar. It's good to have you back on the program, Mr. Henry.
Great to be with you, Lord.
So what is this idea that Representative Cecil Bell Jr. of Texas is trying to put forward?
Well, it's sort of a nullification argument that the states have been involved in or has been floated since, around the time of the Civil War before, and that is that if the Supreme Court or the federal government engages in enforcing or enacting laws or otherwise trying to enforce unconstitutional, extra-constitutional laws outside their powers, the states don't have a duty or an obligation to follow those, and in fact makes the argument that states have an oath and an obligation to refuse to follow them if they're unconstitutional, because obviously the states have the same responsibility to follow the Constitution as the federal government does, and therefore they're not allowed to follow these laws if they're outside the Constitution. And so that is the spirit, the federalism spirit behind these actions by states, including the most recent one here in Texas.
Is there good reason to believe that that's legally valid or constitutionally valid, that a state could simply say, we believe this is unconstitutional, so therefore we're not going to do it, and in doing so we're protecting the rights of our citizens?
Well, there's two ways to think about that. In one respect, if you accede to the authority of the United States Supreme Court as the final arbiter of what the Constitution says, then ultimately they'll be the arbiter of whether or not your very law that tries to nullify federal laws, including Supreme Court decisions, is valid. So it's kind of a circular argument. But there's one other way to think about this, and that is, what if you're not arguing that we should not only, it's not that we shouldn't follow them, it's we're not going to have state and local officials enforce them. In other words, if the feds make a law, we think it's unconstitutional, we determine, then basically what we're saying is that's fine, that federal officials do go about enforcing it, but state officials, state police, municipal police, no officials within the borders of the state are going to have any hand in enforcing this unconstitutional law, basically leaving it to the feds to enforce the law. That's one way to think about it, and that is federalism, and that is something I do not believe that is outside the purview of the state, not to do the federal government's bidding with respect to enforcing federal laws.
I mean, tell me if I flip it around and I look at it the other way, that when states had laws that said black kids can't go to school with white kids and vice versa, that it was the federal government's job to say, you're taking away the civil rights of some of your citizens, and we, the federal government, will not allow you to do that, right? Brown versus the Board of Education and such?
And that's correct, and that, of course, is not only a counter-argument, but it's a good example here is that the federal government actually enforced some of those decisions, including with Eisenhower sent the federal troops into Alabama to enforce the court's order in Brown v. Board and otherwise with respect to the desegregation of public colleges and universities. So what you have is basically a federal authority to enforce its laws based on its court, but in essence, it comes down to an argument of authority. And in this case, the state law in Texas would actually establish a commission to review these decisions and determine whether or not it's one that the state should have a hand in enforcement. So it's not just a thumb your nose, we're not going to follow the Supreme Court decisions or the federal government laws. We're actually going to do some work and determine whether or not we as a state think this is outside the federal government's prerogative. And, of course, we can't keep the federal officers from enforcing their laws, but maybe we could keep some state officers from joining in on the action.
Well, and to what extent does this bear on, say, the questions about enforcement of immigration laws and laws on illegal aliens? Because you remember when the Obama administration went to court to tell Arizona, don't you dare enforce federal law. Federal laws may only be enforced by the federal government, and the state of Arizona wanted to enforce some of the same immigration laws that are on the books, and the federal government took the position that they couldn't do it.
And that is, in essence, federalism in a nutshell, is that in Texas is saying, trying to pass a law saying, with respect to sanctuary cities, that state and local officials must assist ICE officials with respect to immigration laws. But the question is, if that law doesn't exist, the federal government is responsible for enforcing it. And in fact, the federal government is using more stake of federal funds to try to get states and localities to help enforce federal laws. But I don't believe states have an inherent obligation without more to just do the work of the federal government if they're going to pass these laws and whether they're constitutional or not. But that's a good example in the Arizona case where the feds actually said, stop enforcing federal law, Arizona, which is kind of the reverse of what we have here.
Well, let me ask you about that. In that case, there are a couple of federal laws in 8 U.S.C. that say that the states have to help out with the enforcement of immigration laws, and that it's actually a criminal act to try to, conceal the location of illegal aliens, as so many of these sanctuary cities are trying to do. And that one comes with 5 years in prison if you violate it. So don't those federal laws supersede anything that's adopted at the local level that says we don't want to enforce the sanctuary cities?
Well, absent the state nullification thing that we're talking about a little bit here, yes. I mean, the bottom line is the federal government is the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, and no state law withstanding or state constitution. The Constitution makes federal law. It's called the Supremacy Clause. And yes, if a federal law conflicts with a state law, there's over 100 years of Supreme Court authority that says the federal law controls over any state or local law. So with those conflicts, if the federal government wants to enforce that law and send federal officials down here to do an investigation and arrest officials that are either not participating or secreting illegal immigrants in violation of federal law, just like the federal law against smoking marijuana and possessing marijuana is a federal law, which a state law cannot make it legal over federal law. Just because it's legal in Colorado and California does not mean it's legal at the federal level.
Yep.
The feds could start tomorrow arresting people for possessing marijuana in any of those states legally.
Mr. Henry, it's a real pleasure to have you on the program. Byron Henry, an attorney from Dallas-Fort Worth.